I am Allison Mayberry. I am the class of '93, and I work in the advancement office, mostly with alumni on the West Coast, which is how I met Susan last fall. I want to welcome you all to Genre Fiction, the stuff they never teach you in college, which as an English major at Hamilton, I can attest to this. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. As I've been mentioning, if you can put your class year or your affiliation in your photo, that would be helpful. You can just click on the 3 dots at the upper right corner of your photo and rename yourself with your class year. And if you need help, put it in the chat and we will help you. In addition, everyone please mute yourselves or we will mute you. And as you have questions during Susan's presentation, please put them in the chat, and my colleagues Ellen and Krista will monitor the chat and call on you to ask questions during the presentation. We also suggest you put, you choose speaker view instead of gallery view, so you can see Susan as she's talking. And now I will introduce our speaker. Susan Alice Bickford was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and grew up in central New York, the setting for many of her stories. She arrived on the Hill in 1968 and was an inaugural member of Kirkland's class of 1972. Eventually, her passion for technology pulled her to Silicon Valley, where she held a wide range of diverse roles and became an executive at a leading technology company. She is now a full-time author, but continues to be fascinated by all things high-tech. She is the president of the Sisters in Crime Northern California chapter and splits her time between Silicon Valley and her family's home base in Vermont. Bickford writes thrillers and suspense stories that are deeply embedded in the rural areas of New York State and New England, featuring resourceful female protagonists. Bickford's debut novel, A Short Time to Die, was published in 2017 and was nominated for the 2018 Left Coast Crime Best Debut Novel. Her second novel, Edgar-nominated Dread of Winter, was released in October 2019. Her short stories have appeared in the anthologies Fish Out of Water and Fishy Business. I will add that I've read both A Short Time to Die and Dread of Winter, which I finished last night, and I enjoyed them both very, very much, so I highly recommend them. So Susan, thank you so much for joining us. I will hand it over to you.
Okay, good. If we find that things start breaking up, sometimes it's good to stop your video. In fact, I have I'm sure all the Hamilton and Kirkland people recognize Luke Glenn, back of me, very nice. But actually, what I think I'm going to do, just when you get a lot of people, I think it's better not to make things do quite so much work. So instead you get to see a little bit of my dining room and kitchen. Okay, so I'm going to start off by sharing the screen here, this PowerPoint, and we're going to start. Okay. So genre fiction, the stuff they never teach in college. And for good reason. Why would you send your child off to pay a lot of money to learn about genre fiction? But it happens to be a hell of a lot of fun. And there are some people who read nothing but genre fiction, despite having gone to colleges like Hamilton and what was Kirkland. And it's really it's very fun. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the sausage is made and how I ended up here. Oh, there's Cassandra. Hi. Cassandra's in this book, by the way. She's in the second book. Okay, and her husband too, for that matter. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how I got there, what it is, what it ain't, how we get started, some of the rules and how we plot or not, and then where the real writing begins, and some stuff about publishing, because that's changing all the time these days, and some what I'm working on now. Okay, this is a little postcard I put together a couple years ago, and you can sort of see about my places. I was born in Boston, and sort of mentioned in the intro, my family's all from Vermont originally. Somebody needs to be on mute. Can we identify? Can we? Somebody's rumbling around. We need to mute mics. Okay, that's better. I don't know if they muted. Okay, thank you. So the little black dots are where I grew up. So I lived outside of Syracuse in a place called Fayetteville. And then in junior high school, I moved to Rochester, and that's where I spent most of my um, junior high school time. Came back to live in Cazenovia briefly before I went off to college, number 4, at what was then Kirkland, and then in Hamilton. And eventually, um, while I was here, I actually started out as here, meaning Kirkland and Hamilton. I was going to be I wasn't sure at first, but I decided on comparative literature. So I was headed down this comparative literature thing and then got very sucked into doing my art classes. When I realized that in order to graduate, I would have to take nothing but comparative literature classes for the remainder of my time there, 2.5 years or something. I thought, no. So I changed my major to be a fine arts major. And I think I'm lucky in having skipped a lot of the English major kind of stuff. It doesn't necessarily serve you very well as you have to know how to write, obviously, but sometimes it's kind of intimidating knowing too much about the English language, and you're better off just winging it. And while I was there, I really didn't do any creative writing except with Natalie Babbitt. Natalie Babbitt was taught usually about one class a quarter. She started off doing, and then I drifted on, and never really had a chance to circle back with her as I got published, because she just died. That was doing computer animation. They were one of the very first companies doing that, called Digital Effects Inc. And so I went to work for them for a number of years and did some other things. And that was really when I sort of re-embraced my technical side and doing a lot of computer technology, which led to having my own computer business and doing some programming, and finally ended up working for Sun Microsystems in New York City. And they brought me out to California, and the rest is history, as they say. Was with them a long time. And then eventually, I could see they were circling the bowl. So I jumped ship with a nice package, and thought, well, I was just really felt compelled to write, really, really. I knew it was really sure that stuff never sees the light of day. Anyway, but it was fun. I really had a wonderful time doing it, and I really I went back to work and just really wanted to, just couldn't wait to get home and write and write and write. And eventually, I decided not to beat myself up about writing this schlock that I was doing, because I was having such a good time. And sure enough, I sort of found where I wanted to be, which was writing thrillers and stories like that. I didn't even know I was writing a thriller. I was that sort of organic about the whole process, and eventually led to publishing. So several years ago, as the first book was about to come out, about 6 months later, I stopped working as my regular job and just focused on writing. And feel compelled to write. Don't worry about it. It's hard work and very frustrating. But if you're compelled to do it, great. So genre fiction. It was sort of funny, you know, what is genre fiction? Genre fiction, so I copied these from a couple of sources, um, also known as popular fiction. Um, and there's all sorts of genres. And I think the last part of this is really rather key. It appeals to readers and fans who are familiar with that genre. So you may not recognize it right away when you pick up sci-fi or fantasy or something if you haven't read them before. But as you read them, you'll begin to see certain patterns around expectations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little further on. As opposed to literary fiction or non-genre fiction, whatever, it's it says here place a value on entertainment. It tends to, I don't know about that, but it really is this kind of more art, aspires to more of an art level. And when I tell people if they're interested in writing genre fiction, or when they get all hot and bothered about being tagged as a genre fiction writer, it's like, you know, get over it, write what you want to write, have a good time. And, you know, so the thing with genre fiction, no one's going to be reading your books 100 years from now. They just won't. How many writers do we read who wrote 100 years ago? A few who were in the genre era, part of things like Sherlock Holmes, for example, Edgar Allan Poe. A few became classics, but most of us, that's not going to be the case. But it's fun, and a lot of people love to read it. So I've listed a bunch of crime, mystery, thriller subgenres here. It's interesting that in the United States, for marketing purposes, everything's a mystery in this category, and there's no fighting it. But if you go to the UK, for example, they tend to call it crime fiction. And many people do prefer to say, you know, the issue is kind of this crime umbrella, because mysteries and thrillers are actually very different structures in terms of telling tales. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on that. So there's the traditional mystery, which is usually people like Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie. People like that are mentioned when we talk about traditional mystery. And a lot of these are overlapping, by the way. There are thrillers, and I'll talk about that. Cozies, and cozy is almost always combined with the next column, amateur sleuth. So we could have amateur sleuths that aren't cozies, but definition, cozies are an amateur sleuth. And they're, Agatha Christie is also often mentioned as a cozy. She kind of invented the that particular subgenre in a way. Then there are professional sleuths, meaning private eyes, police procedurals, legal and medical, sometimes those are combined. Historical, things can be noir, hard-boiled, soft-boiled, often very aligned with cozies, and suspense. So all these novels have suspense, but suspense as a genre is really a subcategory of thrillers, and that's what my publisher says I write. Romantic suspense, domestic suspense, and so forth. So each one of these has rules about meeting reader expectations, really. It's not so much that you absolutely have to adhere to them, but readers pick up these books with expecting to find certain kinds of things. And I'll zip back to cozies. So cozies, by definition, are almost always set in the countryside. They are, some people stretch this and try to place them in, don't try, they do, place them in urban, more urban settings where it's a neighborhood and so forth. But it's usually a very pleasant rural setting where some kind of murder goes, it comes and disrupts everything. And an amateur sleuth, it's always an amateur sleuth, must come and solve the crime and resolve things. And cozies often have things like cats who help out, recipes, set in a small store owned by the heroine. It's usually female. There are some that are male. They're short. They tend to be about 60,000 words as opposed to 80,000 words. Cozies have some fun characteristics. I have friends who write them, and my friend Mary says, well, in cozies, people die, but nobody gets hurt. So people just sort of drop dead, and then their bodies are found. And usually no bad language, no violence on the page, no sex on the page, and absolutely the top rule is you must not kill a cat, period. So, and pets in general. Dogs are kind of up there also. So each one of these has certain expectations, and you can stretch those boundaries as a writer. Some people get hot and bothered about having rules, but you have to, it's kind of part of the territory that you have to know your readers. What are your readers expecting? And you want to, there's this kind of funny balance of being both familiar and unique that you're trying to strike in each one of these. And I'm going to talk about this one more thing, and then I'll take a little break and allow people to ask some questions if they have anything so far. So the big thing for me, I didn't even know I was writing a thriller. And it's, so there are a number of differences, and I'm going to focus on what I think are the most important ones. In a mystery, whether it's a cozy or even just a traditional mystery, there's a puzzle, usually a murder, that happens right at the very beginning, and that needs to be solved before the world can go back to some kind of normal or anything else can be done. And so there's an external agent, meaning police, private eye, or even an amateur sleuth, who comes in and solves that mystery. And then that builds up to a confrontation. The mystery is solved, life goes back to normal, usually. Obviously, in hard-boiled type of stories, sometimes the endings are not always happy, but there is usually a sense of morality in the sense that people get what they deserve. And that's usually a happy ending, but not always. Now, thrillers are really constructed to be just the opposite. So it's really not a whodunit. You almost always know who the bad guy is. And the big confrontation is actually at the end, or the big event is at the end, the big climax. And that's what you're usually trying to avoid that. And in order to try to avoid that, you need to have the big confrontation. So it's not that other things don't happen along the way that are exciting and thrilling and so forth, but really what you're doing is building toward the big event at the end, whether it's a personal confrontation or a World War III or some other big crime, killing the president, who knows. A lot of things are, kind of subgenre specific within thrillers. They're international thrillers and domestic thrillers and things like that. So another part of thrillers is that the protagonist is the one that's in danger. The protagonist, unlike with the mystery where they're generally external to the crime, like the police or private eye, in a thriller, the protagonist is the center of the story. And they have to be in danger, and their way tied to avoiding that big event. And as I said, the antagonist is usually clear. It's really often more of a howdunit or whydunit, but not a whodunit. And so what I like about thrillers personally is that unlike a lot of mysteries, you can write them just about any way you want. There are no real rules for thrillers. I have my own personal rules and lines that I don't cross, but they, generally speaking, are not imposed. It's a pretty wide open type of subgenre. Um, some of the stuff is pretty gruesome. I don't always care for that, and has themes that I like or don't like or whatever. But I do like the fact that it's a bit more. To me, it feels more open in terms of how I want to handle it. And you can also have a mix. Very definitely. I don't want to make it sound like it's one or the other, but it tends to be primarily a mystery or a thriller. And my first book, there are two narrators, and the primary narrator, Marley, for her, it's definitely a thriller. But there's another narrator who is a sheriff's department detective in California who is trying to solve a murder, two murders, in fact, of two people. And for her, or if you follow her line, it's a police and the two kind of wrap around each other, and which I really enjoyed. And it really ends up being the reader who knows more than anybody, than either side of that. And that's how I write these. So this is a good point. I've been rambling on for a bit here. Do we have any questions that people have raised their hand for or would like to ask?
So I see one question in the chat, and that's from Stephanie, asking about your outlining and planning process. Is that something you want to address now, or is that something you're going to get to, Susan?
I'm going to come to that. Yep.
Okay.
I'm definitely going to talk about that.
Okay. Kathy Crone had a comment about cozies. Kathy, do you want to share that with the group? We probably
Sure.
unmute you. Okay.
Yes. So, yeah, I am a really big consumer of genre fiction, and Hamilton was probably, you know, kind of the one period where I had to I had to read more literary fiction for a little bit. But I distinctly remember in high school I read a lot of mysteries and kind of strayed toward the cozy genre. But there was this one series that a couple books in, that the heroine has this like cute love interest, and then he dies taking down the bad guy, and I was like, never again. So then so now and that was where I got kicked into romance, which is the main genre I read, where like the happily ever after and none of the important people die is like part of the genre premise. So.
That's right. And that is absolutely true. And I've seen this comment many times about cozies where someone follows and just thinks the world of this writer, and then they do something like that, and it's just that's it. They never go back. And it's sort of easy to poo-poo this. Well, any of these genres, we'll kind of get into that, because they really speak to people. People love reading these things, and both like pure romance. Romance novels sell more than just about anything. I think maybe even outsells science fiction, and they're short. They tend to be short. Science fiction tends to be long, and people chew through them like crazy. Just obviously very satisfying. And cozies as mysteries are a lot the same way, and they appeal to that part of us where we really kind of yearn for an idealized world and then all the conflict is contained in a way, and then it gets resolved. And so I think, as a writer, if you're interested in writing, if you're interested in reading, just reading, it's all very personal and it's all very valid. And but I couldn't write something that I couldn't ghostwrite something, for example. I would have a very hard time with that. I really have to write, unless it was exactly what I would normally want to write anyway. So that's very much, that's a very real concern. Now I see another one. Joe has asked, Who are some of my favorite contemporary writers? Oh God, there's so many. Certainly I think the people who got me interested in writing genre fiction back in the 80s were people like Sue Grafton and Sarah Paretsky, sort of seeing women writing in genre, particularly mystery in a broad sense, and thrillers. And that was very inspirational to me, even though it took me a long time to act on that. Contemporary wise, there's a woman I really like reading right at the moment. I think her stuff is in some ways a lot like mine in that it's very centered in setting and place, and her name is Jane Harper. She's actually British. She moved to Australia a number of years ago, worked as a journalist, and has had 3 books out that I think are just amazing. And Megan Abbott, I think is absolutely great. I can probably come up, part of the problem is I'm very bad for names, so. Okay.
There's one other question, Susan, and this may come up, you may be dealing with this later, but Carol Durst-Wertheim, do you want to ask your question? There you are. We need to unmute
How
you.
do you screen?
There you are.
Hi, Susan. I just finished the 2 books in this last week. They're delightful reads. They're great settings. Everybody's back in a very cold winter in, upper central New York. But I remembered the name Cassandra Harris, who I see here. And I said, wait a minute, you have a Cassandra in your book, and you have this very evil Harris family. How do you make your choices or screen how to use an element from your real life and apply it in your fiction? How do you make your choices?
Yeah. So in the first book, I didn't really worry about it because I never thought that would be published. After the first book, and so I named all the villains or most of the villains in my first book after my really good friend, Cassandra Harris's family. Without really, I told her at some point, and at that point I still didn't think we'd be published, and then it was, and there we were. So I sort of made it up to her by putting her in the second book in a better position. And so after the first book, it's fun. It's fun to put people I know in those slots. These days, I ask people before I put them in. And when I do talks, I say, you can leave me a business card, and if you'd like to be in the book as a character, you can write down, and you can say if you're willing to be a victim, the murderer, the bad guy, good guy, So I sort of try to filter those a little bit more. Some people are very happy to be the bad guy, just fine. Not everybody though. So I try to do that a little bit more selectively. But it's kind of a private joke. And that people will recognize themselves and know themselves when they're in there. And let's see, just see if there's anything else before we go on. I like a series. Oh, so I would just say from Maggie Cohn, I don't write series. I don't even enjoy reading series that much. I get bored with series very quickly. And I also hate it when I discover someone and the book looks great and it turns out it's number 5 out of 12 or something, or or that I have to some way go back and read from the beginning or feel I do. And there aren't any series I read. I've read of Sue Grafton's, I've read all of Sarah Paretsky, I've read some people I have. I really admire Agatha Christie, who had the ability to write a series, and it does not matter in what order you read the books. You can read them in any order you want, and it still works. I would feel personally, it's a lot. Some people say it's easier to write a series because you have all these characters and they already exist. I think it's harder. I don't want to feel that way about it. And really, the series of my books is Central New York. That's where they're set. So it's really the setting, which is a character in the book, and everything. That's the series element. The other thing is I like to get to the end and go, poof, you're done. Whatever happened, now that's done. Now it's the rest of your life. Go live it. And so I could go on and on about that. And let's see. Yeah, so
like some recommendations of some authors too. Eliza Graham, Donna Leon.
Yeah. Donna Leon, I think I do know, who, like I said, I'm very bad about names, but I think I do recognize the name Donna Leon. And anyway, so I really didn't plan to talk much about series, but since it's come up, it's just not something that speaks to me. Although I'm working on a book now where Vanessa Alba from the first book might make an appearance. So there we go. So let's go back and keep moving on. I'm just keeping a little bit of an eye on the time. Go through these things. Okay. So getting started. So I thought I would put this up. The movie, I wish it were this simple, really. You know, the movie plot generator. Now this was done for romance and for Hallmark movies, but I mean, I think this is kind of a view that many people have about what it takes to write genre fiction. You know, just pick one from column A, one from column B, column C, and so forth, and you get to the end and like it's done. There's your plot. You got it. And I only wish it was quite that simple, but I do get a big kick out of this because invariably this is, you know, how some people think the sausage gets made, but it's not. So the first thing is really, I think, comes to plotting and how you know what the story is. So there are two ends of the spectrum, plotting versus pantsing. And by pantsing, we mean by the seat of your pants. So plotting, which is, writers like Jeffrey Deaver use this a lot, and he's not the only one. Jeffrey sets out, he creates an outline, tons of detail, corkboards, stick-up notes, timelines, you know, all kinds of stuff, polish, oops, a little bit of a typo there, polish. And then finally, after about 6 months, people like Jeffrey sit down and write. And about 2 months later, they're done. And they describe it as literally like, you know, they'll put up an outline for the chapter that they have worked on for 6 months, and they write directly over that, and that's how they write it. And then there's pantsing, writing by the seat of your pants, Lee Child style. Lee Child sits down every September, or at least that's the way he has been doing it, and starts writing. Doesn't even think about it, just like, okay, time, you know, it's September, time to start. And 6 months later, he's done. And now, I like to remind people that Lee Child spent many, many years in television, writing and producing television shows. And so he does know how to build a story. Most of us do a bit of both. And it's funny, I was thinking about it once when I was doing some heavy plotting, and it's fun in its own right. I mean, you think, oh, I want to see how this evolves, but you can do that when you're plotting too. And some friends of mine were going to have a baby, and they didn't want to know what the sex the baby was. They didn't want their doctor to tell them. They wanted to have the baby be born, and then it would be a big surprise. And I told this to another friend, and she said, but it's always a surprise. It doesn't matter when you find out. It's always going to be a surprise. So it's really about figuring out which kind of surprises you like when you write. So most people are plantsing or prancing, you know, there are a bunch of words for this. But for me, typically, well, I wrote the first book completely by the seat of my pants, and I mean completely. Second time, the thing is the publishers usually like to see what you're going to write. So you don't really have the luxury of until you get to be a big name author, people want to know what you have in mind. So you sort of have to do some plotting. And in fact, most of the time, what I do for any story that I write is I usually get I know what the beginning, I know what the ending is. Often I know the ending first. And then the beginning, because it tends to be very character driven for mine. And so what are the characters that have to come together to make that happen? And then I do a certain amount of plotting to get me from here to there. But part of the fun and part of the surprise is really what happens as I write. And some people say, well, my characters speak to me. And I say, my characters don't speak to me. I own my characters. But there is something in your subconscious that starts pulling these various threads together. And suddenly I'll go, oh, right. Now I remember, oh, I see now how this connects to that. And there is that sort of thing that happens. And as far as I'm concerned, at least for me, I can't think about it ahead of time. It's something organic that's part of the writing process that causes that to happen. Just thinking about writing in my shower, thinking about the plot when I take a walk, thinking about all these little things, doing research, it doesn't happen quite the same way. It just doesn't. So I do a bit of both, and got to work on whatever to make that work. Any questions about this so far? Okay. You can hold, if something comes up, don't worry, we'll be taking another break. Okay, let's go back and. Okay, so beginnings, basically getting it right. I remember my, this goes back to Kirkland. Professor Jaffe, we were studying the Greek tragedies, first semester, freshman year. And the first one we read, as I remember, was Agamemnon. And he pointed out that the whole key is, you don't have a whole lot of backstory. Where does Agamemnon begin? Agamemnon begins when the ship coming back from Troy enters the harbor, and you know that he's going to be dead in about half an hour. That's when the story starts. So figuring out where you're going to get the story started in a way that really kicks off the book is, to me, probably the most work of the whole process. First, you pick a POV, a point of view, for your main character, or characters, as the case may be. For thrillers, it's usually third person. And the reason it's usually third person is because, and this is a rule that many people break, but still, it's a rule that if I write in first person for a thriller, I'm going to be alive at the end. If I write it in third person, there's always kind of this slight question as to whether that character survives. And so it's an important part of the genre. But many people do write even thrillers in first person. But third for thrillers is the most common. Picking a tense. I think it's very hard to write anything in present tense. People who do it and do it well, I read it and I don't even think about that I'm reading it in present tense. But a lot of times I find it hard to write and hard to read. Most books are written in past tense. And it's the easiest. I guess I would say it's the most fitting. I think I even read one that was written in second person, and I'm trying to remember who it was. I was sort of astounded, in present tense, no less. So now you're going to sit down and think about building that structure that's going to get you to the end of the book. And it's usually a 3-act structure, 25%, 50%, 25%. So the first 25% is the hook, the starting bit. And then what typically happens is heroine or hero doesn't want to do it. Oh, I don't want to be dragged into this. And then at the 25% mark, more or less, they commit. They have to follow through. And then there is the dangerous 50% leading up to the climax, which happens at the very end of that. And then there's a slide down. And the 50% is the dangerous place. That's where almost everybody struggles and often fails and has to rewrite and do all that stuff. It's the dangerous middle, the slump in the middle. But if you're doing some plotting, you're thinking about, okay, how do I keep the intensity and the emotion and the suspense building up slowly? It can't be exhausting either. You can't just go from one thing to another without a couple breathing places, because that gets tiresome too. So it's this, how do you construct that? And once again, where is the right place? So to start, it has to be compelling. It has to grab you, and it has to be active. So this is the two biggest things I see when people write, when I'm asked to critique things and so forth, is too much backstory, lots and lots of backstory. They want to front load everything you need to know, or they're telling you this backstory in a way that is exposition. It's not interesting. So when I say active, I mean, there has to be, people don't have to be fighting. They don't even have to be arguing, but they can't be sitting around and thinking about what they're going to be doing. Or it has to be something that carries and you get engaged with right away. And handling backstory is probably the hardest part of, and what I see in other people's work, and I know I struggled with, is how to do that. And I'm going to do some reading that will show you how I tried to handle it. If we have time, we could come back, and if you see get these slides. Janet Reed is a wonderful resource. She's an agent, and she has a blog called The Query Shark, where she rips apart queries. And she also has a daily blog where she shares insights about the publishing industry. Absolutely great. So if we had some time, I'd come back to that. So I'm going to finish up this section and pause for some more questions so you can start thinking about what it is. I love this thing, this cartoon. I did not do it. A guy named Grant Snyder did it. And it is just so perfect. So first of all, you have the deep backstory back here. It's lurking. The lengthy prologue. Oh my God, prologues. Do not write prologues. Anyway, you're not supposed to. And then finally you get going. Finally you have to, and then you have to deal with exposition. So exposition is where you're just telling people stuff. You aren't really doing anything. So it's slow moving, finally rising action, a climax, falling action, and anyway, the plot hole, where something never quite fit, and the badly written tunnel of love, some unresolved subplot, and then the denouement, and then of course the reaction is like everyone's shooting each other and whatever. But this really it captures a lot of what a lot of the elements that we have to struggle with. So before I go into pitfalls, any questions at this point?
I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you have something, please feel free to type it. Or we can go on, because I know I shouldn't say I know. I'm eager to hear some of your reading.
Yeah. So here's some common pitfalls, and then I'll do a little bit of writing. Things that you're told to avoid. These are rules, if you will, and generally speaking, these are things to pay attention to. Backstory. Okay. Weather. Do not start with the weather. That's always, of course, there I was writing a book about the weather, but I hope in a different way. Dreams, waking up for a dream, dreaming about the dream, all this stuff in the dreams. Oh, and looking in mirrors. I forgot. Figuring out what people look like because they look in a mirror. Prologues. So a lot of people do write prologues. The general rule these days in contemporary stuff today is no prologues. And Elmore Leonard is the person who really pushed this in a very big way, because a prologue is inherently backstory. So there's that nasty word, backstory. And you can drop it in anywhere you want. But you have no connection yet, usually, to the characters, to the setting, to the people, to what's going on. So it's really serves to set up this backstory and actually keep us from getting into the story itself. And it is rarely the hook, rarely the thing that really makes you want to read the book. Tell versus show. So don't tell me stuff, show me stuff. Use real dialogue tags. Said, asked, answers, answered, period. Don't say things that aren't even dialogue, that you can't say, like, he laughed. No. Laughing is not talking. Laughing is laughing. Things like that. Adverbs, Tom Swifties. Tom said sweetly, Tom did quickly, Tom raised, all these things. These are all tell. They're not showing you what happened. They're sort of relying on you to fill in that. And exposition, which is where Susan woke up, she thought about her mother, she thought about her father, she thought about her time at Kirkland, she remembered this, this is really boring. Head hopping, usually these days we don't do omniscient point of view where you're allowed to jump around from one head to the other in a scene. You pick a point of view and you stick with it for that scene. You can switch after the scene. And then you have to make a choice on commas. And if you ever want to get a bunch of writers really yelling at each other, you can talk about the Oxford comma and whether to use it and whether not. And I tend to not worry about commas personally. Okay, I'm just going to go see what I have for the next slide because I sort of forgot. Okay, so this is a good point to do some reading, some actual reading. And I'm going to start with, excuse me, what I'm doing is looking through my, okay, here we go. That's a short time to die. Oh, this is the very beginning of Dread of Winter, and I'm going to choose this and a couple others to show you how I tried to grapple with stuff. Like, how do I introduce a character? If we say no backstory, how do I introduce the character? If you say no weather, how do I describe in some kind of active way the setting, what it's like, all these kinds of things, and yet also, and so I'll read this a little bit, and I'm reading it in soft copy because that means I can look almost into the camera rather than looking down at a book. So this is the first chapter of Dread of Winter. As the car rounded the last bend, Sydney tried to lean forward to catch a glimpse of her mother's house. She moved too fast. The seatbelt froze, retracted, and moved up to cut off the circulation in her neck. Resistance was futile. She would have to stay firmly pinned to her seat for a couple hundred more yards. Midway through the turn, the back end of the car fishtailed on an icy patch, hidden under the gray slush covering the road. Sydney pressed her right foot on the phantom brake on the passenger side. Francine Buckley deftly straightened the vehicle. Damn town, that curve isn't banked properly and they know it. Bad enough in summer, but ice builds up there all winter no matter how much sand and salt they throw on it. Every time I drive through town, her voice trailed off in a string of grumbled obscenities. Sydney lifted her foot. She didn't exactly disagree, but driving a bit slower might have solved Francine's problem without any investment required by the town road crew. Too bad about your mom, kiddo. Man, that was fast. Glad you were able to get back in time from Colorado. Francine thumped her hands twice on the steering wheel. California, Sydney said. After driving in silence for over an hour, her companion now seemed to be in a mood to talk. She vaguely remembered Francine as one of the lunch ladies at the high school and wondered how well she had known Sydney's mother. Perhaps that was a silly question. Everyone knew everybody in a tiny town like Ariska, New York. Yeah, oh yeah, well, a long way. I guess it goes to show, you never know when your time's gonna come up. I bet you never thought you'd be coming home like this. I never thought I'd be coming home, period, Sydney said. She slipped the fingers of her left hand between the seatbelt and her neck. They don't got weather like this in California, do they? Francine pointed her chin toward the steep drifts left by the snowplow on either side of the road. There's snow up high in the mountains, but it never snows where I live. No kidding, sounds boring. I'm not complaining. I hear Randy didn't come to the hospital. Sydney felt a bubble of pain move down her chest. I kept calling his cell number and left messages. Maybe he's out of town. Out of something, that's for sure. Up to no good as usual. Francine continued with a barely audible string of epithets and made a jerking off gesture in her lap with her right hand. Sydney had to clear her throat before she could speak. Are you saying he's been cheating on my mother? I'm saying he's a sweet-talking, good-looking guy, way younger than your mother, who has always done exactly what he wants, just like the rest of his family. Those Jaquiths have no impulse control. What could possibly go wrong? What? Don't look at me like that. Am I right? I'm not arguing with you, friend. At least he can't cheat on her anymore. That's the upside of being dead. Yep. So that's, so you can sort of see, I'm not saying I did a perfect job of it, but you kind of, I think given the things that I've introduced, but I'm trying to introduce this climate, the time of year, the people, what happened, the mothers died, where's the boyfriend, all that kind of stuff. We only have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to get back and just kind of go through the last few slides so we have a little bit more time, hopefully for some questions. And anyway, you write, and then you finally write the end, and then the real writing begins. Writing your first draft is just the beginning. Jean-Paul Sartre never rewrote anything. He counted on Simone de Beauvoir to rewrite everything for him. And I don't even think he noticed what she changed. But revision and editing are what make the book. And it's a lot of hard work. And I've come to appreciate it, but I really hate it. I love writing first drafts. It's very hard to write. And it's like cleaning a really dirty house. It's very satisfying when it's done. It's a lot of work to get there. So finishing off a little bit, what's going on these days, and it's just, I can't imagine really, and I think a lot of people don't know what the impact of the current pandemic is going to have on the publishing business. Traditional publishing, you have to do queries and blurbs and quotes, and you have to go get an agent, and the agent finds you a publisher, and then a year and a half to 2 years later, your book comes out. On the other hand, they have lots of ways to promote the book, to get it into stores, and a lot of prizes and so forth won't even look at you unless you're traditionally published. There's no question that the self-publishing, indie, mixed publishing trend is growing and growing. It is, and in fact, most authors end up doing both over time. If they have any story backlist, they'll end up self-publishing their backlist, for example. But it's very, there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, going forward. There are just so many stores that are going to be closing. The advantage of being in hardcover or paperback is not as clear. It's financially, obviously, a lot of publishing houses, I think, are going to be struggling. So with me, interestingly, I had a 2-book contract with Kensington, and then I was working on my 3rd book, and I was negotiating or talking to them about, let's do another 2 books or something. And they called me in January and said, we aren't going to give you a new contract. I'm sorry, just, you don't sell enough books. And then a week later, I got nominated for the Edgars. And the Edgars, for those who don't know, thriller, the Edgars are kind of the Oscars of prizes for mysteries and thrillers. There are other prestigious ones too, but the Edgar really does sit right on top. I didn't win. Spoiler alert. There were 5 other books. The books were all terrific. And I didn't get the final prize, but I am absolutely thrilled. And it's really genuinely a huge honor to have been nominated for that. And I'm not complaining one little bit about not having won. So I stopped that 3rd book I was writing on and restarted another one. This one actually starts in Vermont, but I might switch it back to Central New York. Basically, this woman takes on the identity of her cousin who was murdered by mistake. And Connie realizes that she was the one who was supposed to murder. She takes Claire's identity, her cousin, her lookalike cousin, and says, okay, I'm off to, I'm out of here. But, it turns out that taking on someone else's life is not as easy as you think it might be, particularly once you're an adult. And so she's rather shocked when she realizes that her cousin Claire is on the run from her parole officer and a number of debt collectors, and into a whole different realm of hurt and jeopardy in California. This, by the way, I pitched this to my agent as, this is a big book. So what is a big book? Agents want a big book, and they won't even tell you what it is. The big book is, name like Dan Brown's books. What am I thinking? His very first one in particular.
Da Vinci Code? Da Vinci Code?
Yeah, the Da Vinci Code. It's a big book. There are all these other big books, and they often don't have very much in common. So anyway, this is my pitch at trying to make a big book. So that's what I'm working on now. And finally, just, if you're interested in writing, or even any writing organizations, love to have readers come and participate. Every genre has usually its things. Some are a bit in disarray. The Romance Writers of America went through a huge kerfuffle over basically racial issues earlier at the end of 2019. They're struggling to get back. ITW, the International Thriller Writers, Bouchercon, this is rippling through a lot of groups, but inherently they're all, they're hanging in there and they're still around, and many of them are really good organizations once they get their act together. And books aren't going to go away. I'm not sure what it means for, in terms of financially, but we're always going to be telling stories, and there are always going to be books, and they will always be around. As to whether, sometimes people ask me whether we're going to be talking about COVID-19 in our books, and my feeling is, I'll bet not. Because people don't like being miserable. They don't go to, they go to books for release. And if you look what happened after the Spanish flu, so-called Spanish flu, 100 years ago, within a year after the flu burned itself out, the misery they're experiencing or had to go through. For crime, our mystery writers of Paretsky in the early 80s, along with a number of other women writers, to promote, and women writers specifically, but certainly as the organization has evolved, focusing on all writers, particularly who are underserved and need a leg up in the publishing business. And I think that is the last slide. So with a few minutes to spare, or maybe people have to bounce off, but I can hang out for a bit for people who have questions.
Yes, who has questions? We can unmute if people are there. You should be unmuted. If anybody wants.
Time. So, yeah, they're somewhat written down. I would say personally, if you want to write, don't worry about them, particularly for your first draft. Just write.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think writing in cliches and as shortcuts for what you want was the dark and stormy night. Go on to the next paragraph. You know, get it written, and then go back and fix it. I mean, don't leave them there like that. But actually, worrying too much about the rules, I think, can be very constraining. And for your first draft, I have some friends who say they just barf it out. And then they go back and they revise. I don't do that. I don't barf it out. But everyone finds their own way. And I would say whatever helps keep things lubricated for you, don't worry about it in the first draft. Worry about it when you go back and revise. Anything else?
Other questions? Comments?
I missed most of it. I saw that it was being recorded. Does that mean I can go and see what I missed?
Yes, we do record almost all of our programs. This one is being recorded and it will be posted on our website probably in about a week. It takes a little while because we clear out some of the chit chat at the beginning, but it will be posted on the website.
And that's the Hamilton alumni website or something like that?
Yes, if you go to events, there's a box on the right hand, there's something on the right that says past events or view past events, and you can.
Okay. I'm not much of a joiner these days, so I haven't joined that, but maybe I'll just have to.
Do.
Thanks.
Here's a question about how long have you been writing, Susan?
Well, I really seriously started writing about 2004. That's when I did the whole, Lord of the Rings thing. But really, I think that when I finally settled down and started, really thinking, it was probably about 10 years ago. Up until that point, I really didn't take myself very seriously. I was just, playing around. At that point, I suddenly said, I really like this. And I also sort of found a genre that I really enjoyed and started to focus on that. So, and as a kid, I thought I would be a writer, I'd be a painter. I mean, And I went through that spell in college with Natalie where I thought I would be doing children's literature. But I had a wonderful career. I had a great time. I had a lot of fun. It paid money. Thank you very much. And now I can be a writer. Writing does not typically pay anything that you can count on.
And when you found the genre, was it because you liked reading that genre, or?
I didn't like reading that genre, but I basically found a story for myself that like I said, I wasn't even really too clear what I was writing when I wrote the first one. I was in a class and I described it and they said, "Oh, you're writing this thriller. You're writing a country noir thriller." I was like, oh, okay. So I knew it was some sort of mystery thing, but I knew it was different than a regular mystery. I just hadn't really zeroed in on the thriller as the thing that I really wanted to write.
Good. Other questions, comments? If not,
Thank you.
Turn everybody back to their evenings. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I had great seeing some friends and some new friends. And Marjorie, hey, Marjorie made it. Hooray.
Susie, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, great seeing new friends and old friends, and this has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Susan. We're so glad you all could join us.